if you're going to protect the biological diversity, if you're going to protect the tigers and the lions and the Komodo dragons and the butterflies in those great ecosystems, you have to also not just take into consideration, but improve the lives of the people living there, help them have better lives in the context of preserved biological diversity, rather than making it a choice between their livelihoods and protecting biological diversity.
So welcome to everybody, and welcome David Quammen. Thank you for accepting our invitation to be our guest.
Thank you, Telmo. Always good to talk with you.
For this dialogue with the community of Lucy. And we start with the new book. It's not exactly a new book. It's a new edition, new Italian edition.
New thanks to you and thanks to Cortina.
Exactly. Thanks to Raffaello Cortina, publisher. And it's about Darwin. But it's about a special part of Darwin history, Darwin biography. So before the publication of the masterpiece, the original species. So why did you decide to talk about the reluctant Mr. Darwin?
Well, I was asked to write a short essayistic biography of Darwin, and there have been some big, thorough, ponderous, and excellent biographies of Darwin. I wanted to create something different, something new, something for people who didn't know much about Darwin, their first introduction to Darwin. And I thought that the best way to do that would be to, in particular, highlight Darwin as a young man when he was first working through his ideas about the question of whether species evolve, change in time, and if so, how. So I focused on the period of time in particular, right after he got back from the voyage of the Beagle, his 5-year trip around the world, and mostly before he published his book, The Origin of Species, when he was a young man who was uncertain, and a young man who had a radical idea and felt some discomfort at sharing it with the world because he knew it would cause a lot of discomfort in other people, it would cause controversy, it would upset people. And he worked through these ideas in a very methodical way because he was a great pursuer of truth, of fact, and of science. And so I tried to show him step by step, working through the facts that he had and the ideas that he had toward a theory.
He was feared about the scientific community, the church, or the possible reactions to the publication of his
All
ideas?
of the above. I think one of the important things to be aware of is that at his time, in the middle of the 19th century, the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, the church establishment and the scientific establishment were really one establishment. Church and science were together on the question of where species came from, where life and its diversity came from. And they were together around the idea that God had specially created every species just in the form that we see it and put those creatures down in the places where we see them. And this was called natural theology. Mm-hmm. So natural history combined with theology created this philosophical framework, natural theology. And that's what natural theology said about the origin of biological diversity. And Darwin had a much different idea, and that was the idea that laws, physical laws of the universe, rather than the intervention of God, accounted for diversity and adaptation among living creatures. And so he knew that it would upset the church, but it would also upset people such as his teachers at Cambridge University, Adam Sedgwick, John Henslow, William Whewell, people who were prominent scientists, but who were also embracing this religious view of God having created.
His mentor, Charles Lyell, the founder of modern geology.
Charles Lyell, yes, absolutely. So he knew that he would upset them and he would disappoint them and alarm them. That was part of what made him so reluctant to publish this theory.
Yeah, it's an irony of the history because in the Christ College in Cambridge, Darwin was guest in the same room that William Paley, the founder of the natural theology, So strange connections.
Right. Yes.
And
yeah.
then he will discover natural selection.
So he was embedded in that whole tradition. William Paley, yes, natural theology, uh, and it was not just like going against some, some bishops and theologians who rejected science. Science embraced this earlier idea as well as religion. So he really, really was alone, or almost entirely alone. There were some other thinkers who had talked about evolution, but never had a theory that really explained it the way he did.
Yeah. And at the end, so we have 20 years, so waiting for new evidence, discoveries, 8 years working on barnacles, so as a specialization, and then the publication of the work. But let me ask you something more methodological, because in many of your books, I think in quite all of your books, you usually use characters. So you put on the scene different actors, so scientists, and I'm wondering, you started your career studying William Faulkner, right? So this wonderful story with many actors. So it's something connected. So did you use your expertise on Faulkner in order to talk about science as a great theater piece?
Well, I think so. As you said, I did my academic work on William Faulkner, and in particular on the way William Faulkner structured his very sort of experimental, unconventional novels. But my writing career, I began as a novelist myself. So I have always been a storyteller. And when I transitioned into nonfiction and focused on science, I took that with me. I took Faulkner's sense of structure, which is very important in all my long, complicated scientific books, and in short books like this one. Structure is very important. I think about that, because structure is a tool that you use to keep the readers interested, to present them with things that are unexpected and yet feel inevitable once they've been presented. But the other thing I brought with me was the sense that you tell stories about people. Even when you write about science, when you write about evolutionary biology, when you write about molecular phylogenetics, when you write about emerging viruses, if you're writing about science for people, people like to read about people. So you write about the people who do the science. And I've never had a better opportunity to put that idea into effect than being asked to write a biography of Charles Darwin, where you're writing about the science, but you're writing about this man. And writing about him, what I wanted to do was write about him not as the famous Charles Darwin, but as this young man who didn't know he was going to be famous, who didn't know he was going to change the world, who didn't know he was going to be successful in launching this radical idea. And that makes it exciting, I think, to look at this young man working through this challenge.
Yeah, exactly. And another point that makes very effective this way to explain science, that you are immersed in the history when it happens, not from the future, not with the perspective from the future. So we know that Darwin then became so very important.
Right.
But then you tell the story from the within.
Yeah, I tried to do that, and I hope that comes across, yes. Because he left us some very important documents, very important glimpses into his mind. He left us, as you well know, he left us the transmutation notebooks. He kept these 4 little notebooks, not much bigger than my passport.
Exactly.
Whereas here's my notebook, not much bigger than that. He could carry them in his jacket, and he recorded his thoughts. He was talking to himself about the possibility of evolution.
Just a private writing.
Private writing. So there are these 4 notebooks which have been edited and published, and you did the Italian version of that yourself. The notebooks of Charles Darwin, the evolutionary notebooks of Charles Darwin. And he also left us letters. He wrote lots of letters, and people wrote letters back to him. And Cambridge University Press has published a multi-volume edited set of the letters of Charles Darwin. So when I was writing this book, my primary sources were the notebooks, the secret notebooks about evolution, and the personal letters of Darwin. And that allowed me to see what he was thinking when he was 27 years old, when he was 28 years old.
I always think what Darwin could have done with internet, with the web, with the
Yeah.
emails.
Yes, yes. He would write letters to some naturalist in India asking a question, what does the male of a particular duck species look like? And then he would have to wait 6 months to get an answer to that. And now, when I do my research, if I have a question like that, I send an email, and if I'm lucky, I get an answer from India in an hour.
Exactly. And another wonderful book in which you explain characters is The Tangled Tree. So Carl Woos has the main actor, and then Lim Margulis enters
Yeah.
the scene, then Fort the Little. So, and this is a case in which we see that Darwin has been revised. So
Yeah.
we know something new. So why did you decide to talk about The Tangled Tree and
Well,
this?
that was a very tricky challenge, that book. And I presented to my publisher a couple of ideas for books. What do you want to do next, David? Well, I could do this, I could do this, I could do that. And they said, we like the one about the tree of life. So write the one about the tree of life. And I thought, okay, that's going to be tricky, because the story of the redrawing of the tree of life in light of 20th century discoveries from genome sequencing. The field is called molecular phylogenetics, using molecular biology, genome sequencing, to draw the tree of life. And this scientist in Illinois in the US, Carl Woes, I talk about him sometimes to audiences, the most important biologist of the 20th century that you've never heard of.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
And so he figured out...
He would deserve the Nobel Prize for his
He did deserve a Nobel Prize, absolutely. He thought so too.
Yeah, exactly.
But he didn't get one. But he pioneered this field. He pioneered very early, primitive, difficult, arduous, dangerous ways of sequencing bits of genome. So he could compare at the gene level different organisms to see how they're related. Who's related to who? Who are cousins? Who are siblings? Who are distant cousins? Who is the ancestor? Using gene sequences, bits of genome sequences, to draw the tree of life. And he did that, and he made discoveries that were counterintuitive about what was related to what, including we humans. It turns out our very earliest ancestor is a microbe called the archaea, which before Carl Woes, it wasn't even known to exist. The archaea looked like bacteria, and when he looked at their genomes, he said, these are not even bacteria. These are something else that we didn't even know. A third kingdom of life on Earth. We didn't even know it existed. And then he not only discovered it, he showed that we humans and all other animals descended from that particular kind of microbe and not from bacteria. And then other scientists, such as the great Lynn Margulis, who she pioneered the idea that complex life arose through a process she called symbiogenesis, the joining together, symbiotic joining together of two different forms of life. So the archaea captured a form of bacteria, and instead of digesting the bacteria, it turned the bacteria into an internal organ.
Yeah. So, and this means that evolution is not just competition, but it could be also cooperation. It could be
Exactly.
a division of labor. And
that was a great message from Lynn Margulis. And I was lucky I had a chance to spend time with her before she died. She was a wonderful, crazy, intelligent, opinionated, outgoing woman. When I went to her seminar in Massachusetts, she said, David, come to my seminar. Sat through her seminar. We went back to her house. Then suddenly she turned into like my aunt, and she's cooking this stew, and she's got some other friends and students coming in, and we're all sitting down, and Lynn is cooking this stew. It was a wonderful experience.
Yeah, we invited her many times in Science Festival in Italy, and she was great. She was very brilliant as a speaker.
Oh,
and mostly for a young audience.
Yeah,
she was great, very inspiring. But another point is in your book, even when you talk about the history of science, there's a lot of themes that could be intended as way to interpret the present. In the case of the horizontal gene transfer, we know that this is the way to which bacteria evolved the ability to resist to antibiotics.
Absolutely.
And this is an emergence today, right?
That's right. And this was a very counterintuitive discovery from the work of Carl Woese. And you mentioned Ford Doolittle, a great American-Canadian scientist who did a lot of the important early work in making people realize how important was this completely counterintuitive phenomenon, horizontal gene transfer, genes moving sideways from one species to another rather than vertically from ancestors to descendants. And it turns out that this horizontal gene transfer has occurred a number of times, continues to occur. It's very common among bacteria, but it also occurs in animals. Genes can be carried by viruses, picked up in one species, a section of gene, and carried into another species by viral infection. And from bacteria to bacteria, which is hugely important because that's what allows the problem of antibiotic resistance in bacteria to spread so quickly. And this problem is killing 2.7 million people a year die of antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Tuberculosis.
Antibiotic-resistant strep and staphylococcus. Very terrible problem. Why has it spread around the world? Not just because bacteria evolve fairly quickly and they can acquire adaptations to be resistant to a particular kind of antibiotic, but because when bacterial species A acquires resistance, it can pass that resistance in a horizontal transfer of genes to species B in an instant.
Yeah. Another form of life that evolved very rapidly are viruses, the other side of microbial world. What is the situation today? Because we are very, very worried about H5N1.
Right.
And so you are the author of Spillover and Breathless. So what is the situation today? Because we don't have so much data now from the USA about what is happening.
It's a terrible situation. It's a terrible situation right now. It's crazy. In the U.S., the government, this particular government is shutting down support for science. It's shutting down research in dangerous viruses. It's shutting down the promotion of vaccine development and vaccine access for people. We're blinding ourselves to the danger presented by new emerging viruses, including most prominently H5N1 avian influenza, bird flu, which is circulating in wild birds all over the world. It's getting into poultry flocks all over the world. We have 33 billion chickens on this planet at a given moment, and those 33 billion chickens are a great big petri dish for the evolution of bird flu viruses. And we have something like 1 billion pigs on this planet. And pigs are important because human influenzas can infect pigs, bird influenzas can infect pigs, and when two kinds of influenzas get into a pig, they can swap sections of their genome. Out comes a third form of influenza that potentially has all the danger of a bird flu and all the infectiveness in humans of a human flu. The clock is ticking right now, tick-tock, very loudly. Maybe nothing will happen with bird flu, and maybe the next pandemic will start tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah, it's an uncertainty, so we should work on prevention, but this is not the case. So we should share data and we should work and find new vaccine with mRNA and so.
Right. And I've been talking with Vittorio Lingiardi and others in the Italian community that pursue the discipline called One Health, recognizing that human health, animal health, ecosystem health, it's all part of the same subject. And they are helping to spread the warning. We need prevention, we need warning, and we need response to viruses. And the things that we're doing, particularly in America, but not just in America, are making it difficult to impossible to do that. Prevention and warning are being dismantled.
David, in the books where you collect your wonderful reportage for National Geographic, you describe ecology and the value of biodiversity. And Darwin, we started with Darwin. Darwin was the founder of ecology. We quite never recall that, because Darwin wrote wonderful pages about the entangled tank. And so the idea that nature is connection, interconnection. So is it true that Darwin is the real founder of the ecology?
Well, I think it's fair to say yes, because as you mentioned, the very last sentence of his great book, The Origin of Species, he talks about the entangled bank. Imagine an entangled bank that consists of vegetation, trees and bushes, and the trees and bushes are all filled with birds, and on the ground there are worms crawling around, and all these different life forms, endless forms, most wonderful. And he says it's amazing to think that these endless forms interacting with one another arose from one source, or perhaps just a few, and have evolved over time to give us what we have, which is not just a diversity of species, but an interconnection of diverse species in systems that function, and that's ecology.
Then the word has been invented by Ernest Haeckel in 1866
Haeckel,
in a letter with Darwin, talking about
ecology. And I believe the origin from, I forget if it's Greek or Latin, but it means essentially the study of the home, study of the house.
The oikos,
oikos,
our home.
Greek, right? Oikos,
exactly.
Our home. Study of our home. Good to think of ecology in that way.
Yeah. It's quite sad that in your book, you describe also the destruction of biodiversity. So now the situation is not good, and the tree of life has been pruning. So with extinction of many branches of the tree of life. So why and what can we do according to your experience, your many reportage in Africa or in...
Well, this is something that's been a big concern to me ever since I started writing nonfiction, probably before that. So for 40 years, I've been writing about the problem of extinction, not just evolution, but extinction, and not just natural extinction that happens inevitably. New species come into being and old species disappear, but mass extinctions, sudden extinctions where the total planetary fund of biological diversity is reduced drastically in a short period of time. There have been 5 mass extinctions throughout the history of life over the last 3 billion years, caused by the impact of an asteroid or catastrophically changing climate because of the tilt of the earth and other
volcanic eruptions.
Yes, right. But the 6th natural extinction, some people now call it the Anthropocene extinction, the 6th natural extinction, the 6th mass extinction, has been happening in the last few hundred years, caused by humans, caused by the success of the human species, caused by our intelligence, our capacities for technology, our hunger, our irrigation of resources. So we've been causing this mass extinction. And some scientists that were very important to me were warning about this early on. Paul Ehrlich, Norman Myers, Edward O. Wilson, who became a friend of mine as well as an inspiration to me, was warning about this. And I have been writing about it since the 1980s, but in books since the 1990s. My book, The Song of the Dodo, is about evolution and extinction on planet Earth and what that has to do with islands, and with islands on the mainlands. Now that we have chopped the mainlands up into little pieces, some of which we call national parks, but which function as islands, and islands are where species go extinct. So the more we turn the mainlands of the world into polka dots of isolated ecosystem, the more biological diversity we lose. And that's happening at a catastrophic rate now.
Yeah. It's interesting because I remember that when Edward Wilson or Niles Eldredge and Paul Harry and others for the first time told about the 6th mass extinction 25 years ago, they were accused to be apocalyptic dramatic, catastrophic, so exaggeration. And today we can find the same data on nature science every week. And another point that is interesting to explain to our audience is that everything is interconnected, because if we destroy biodiversity, we have higher risk of pandemic, because we destroy, it's something connected to One Health. So it's important to explain that everything.
Absolutely. And this is something I agree with you. It's a great concern to me. I've written about it and I've talked about it. And I think of it as the three rivers of trouble, the three rivers of woe that we have on this planet. Young people now are very concerned, as well they should be, about climate change. So you hear a lot about climate change. And some people, particularly people who don't know the history of all these things, say, well, climate change is this terrible problem and it's the cause of all of our problems. Are we losing species? It's because of climate change. Climate change is a factor. But what we have are three great big problems that are flowing like three big brown rivers. And they're flowing off the same mountain, the same melting snowfield on a mountain. And those three rivers are interconnected, but they, to some degree, are independent. Those three rivers of trouble are climate change, loss of biological diversity, and pandemic threats. The emergence of new pandemic diseases for humans. Those are interconnected. It's not that climate change contains the other two problems. Those are separate rivers, although there are channels that interconnect them. They're flowing off the same source. The source is a snowfield on this mountain that is melting and feeding these three rivers. And the melting of the snowfield, that's a metaphor for human population size, time multiplied by consumption. 8 billion people, hungry, highly capable of technology, demanding resources of all sorts, demanding, carbon fuel resources and demanding natural resources from forests. We're cutting down forests, we're eating wildlife, we're burning fossil fuels. All of those things are melting that snowfield and feeding those three great rivers of trouble.
Very good metaphor to explain what we call the polycrisis, so the different crises interconnected. In your books, you describe another very important point for me and for Lucy. So the fact that it's impossible to protect biodiversity if we are unable to protect cultural diversity. So the history of native peoples that are connected to biodiversity or local communities. And why are you interested in that? In this, for example, you explained this wonderful project of the Peace Parks in Africa. So
yes, and I wrote about some of those cases in my book, The Heartbeat of the Wild, which is based on a collection of stories that I reported for National Geographic magazine. They were sending me all over the world for 20 years saying, write about this wild place, write about this wild place, write about this conservation project. So I did.
It's a dream for everyone.
Oh, well, and it was for me too.
Very lucky.
Yeah. But one of the things that emerges from a study of conservation efforts around the world, conservation needs, conservation emergencies, conservation projects that work, one of the things that emerges is that you can't protect biological diversity virtually anywhere on the planet without taking into account the people who live in it or around it. The local people, the people who are living sometimes very difficult rural lives, struggling to grow a little bit of food to feed their family. Those people are living adjacent to or within the great forests, the great ecosystems. And so if you're going to protect the biological diversity, if you're going to protect the tigers and the lions and the Komodo dragons and the butterflies in those great ecosystems, you have to also not just take into consideration, but improve the lives of the people living there, help them have better lives in the context of preserved biological diversity, rather than making it a choice between their livelihoods and protecting biological diversity. So there are cases such as Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, where a number of people have worked very hard, including a very wealthy American named Greg Carr, who made this a project of his heart, to work with Mozambican scientists and Mozambican people to create an area called the Gorongosa National Park project, a national park that deserved preserving, but then a buffer zone around it filled with the people who have lived there forever, for generations, for hundreds of years, and make the national park something that is the best thing that ever happened to them. So national park that brings in tourists, brings in revenue, brings in support from many different nations to help those people in the surrounding area keep their daughters in school rather than marrying them off at the age of 12, grow crops in more efficient ways so they don't have to cut down new forest.
And the soldiers stopped guerrilla, and then now they work in the park, right?
That's right. Yeah, this was
a real alternative to war.
This national park was a battleground during the Mozambican Civil War between the rebel forces and the government forces. And the rebel forces were based there. The rebel forces were eating up the wildlife. They were killing the elephants to sell the ivory for ammunition. And there was a very foresightful President Chissano of Mozambique, who teamed together with Nelson Mandela just across the border in South Africa and said, let's create a peace park. A cross-boundary peace park. And those two men pioneered this idea, and then Greg Carr came in with millions and millions of dollars and helped. And it's a very successful project that takes into account for the long term the fact that you have to help the people in order to protect the wildlife, protect the ecosystem, and also help the people because it's the right thing to do.
Exactly. Is the project still ongoing, still working?
Yeah. I was back there in September. And it's Mozambique was hit by a terrible typhoon. And the national park served as a headquarters for delivering aid to people. They turned it into sort of a helping station for people, and they got through the horrible consequences of the typhoon. And the park continues to thrive. And it has support from Norway and from Germany and from countries around the world and from other funders in addition to Greg Carr. And it has great support from the Mozambican government. And it's a terrific partnership.
Great idea. Let me conclude with the final question about future. So your next book will be about the cancer has an evolutionary system. So is it true? So why this topic? Wonderful topic.
Cancer is an evolutionary phenomenon. The fact that in order to understand cancer, this terrible problem, terrible disease that it infects not just humans, but all kinds of animals, they suffer from cancer. In order to understand it and in order to treat it in humans, it is very advantageous to recognize that it's an evolutionary phenomenon. A tumor is a population of cells with genetic variation, and those cells compete against one another for resources. So it's the survival of the fittest going on in a tumor in a human being. And unless you understand that, there will be futility in trying to treat that tumor just by trying to kill every possible cell. So there are implications for human treatment, but it's also it's a broader phenomenon that is illuminated by the fact that the Tasmanian devil, a little marsupial scavenger on the island of Tasmania, has been devastated by a plague of genuinely infectious cancer, a tumor that passes from one Tasmanian devil to another because they bite one another when they're competing for food and for mates. And the biting passes the tumor. The tumor is passed from devil A to devil B. It grows, and it's a phenomenon that's supposed to be impossible. I wrote a magazine piece about it in 2007 about contagious cancer in the Tasmanian devil and what it says about cancer generally. And for the past 18 years, I've been wanting to turn it into a book, and I've just finished the first draft of that book. So it'll be out sometime next year. It probably will be titled Speak of the Devil.
Oh, okay. Speak of the devil. So we wait for read it. Again, Darwin anyway. So again, another
Darwin
way
cancer,
to see Darwin in contemporary world. So thank you so much, David. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome, Telmo. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
See you soon.
Always a pleasure to be back in Italy.
Thank you so much.